Thanks to Professor Roski. Now, Professor Minxin Pei.
Thank you. I'm very honored to be here tonight. The Jackson School is one of the finest institutions in international relations studies, and you have a very strong China studies program with experts like Professor Susan Whiting in the audience. You can feel how intimidated I am tonight. Following Tom Roski is especially hard because economists and political scientists see the world very differently. When it comes to China, the difference is huge. Political scientists tend to see problems, tend to see the dark side of China's rise. Economists are obsessed with one thing, that is the growth number. And also, looking at China from the outside and looking at China from the inside present huge disparities in perspective. If you look at China from outside, you always feel it always looks stronger, more powerful, its growth more sustainable. But if you look at the same country from inside China, you see more problems, more up close, and you have a more skeptical view about its future. And I suffer from this double bias. Although I don't live in China, I'm ethnic Chinese, and I read Chinese publications as my main source of information. And as somebody who does not trust official sources very much, I have this habit of focusing on negative aspects of China's growth. So I just want to lay out my prejudices ahead. But tonight, the theme of my talk is the inflection point China is at. We know that China's economic growth has been very successful, but according to Chinese official views, and on this we need to take them seriously, China's growth is going to enter a very different stage. The kind of growth that lifted China from, say, $1,000 as per capita income to roughly $4,000 today is not going to keep them going in the next, say, phase of growth. You cannot expect the same bag of tools to play the same role in lifting China from, say, $4,000 per capita to $10,000 per capita. So this is one inflection point. The other is obviously the international aspect. China is no longer a rising power. China is a power that has risen. We feel the presence of China's much expanded global presence economically, geopolitically, militarily, on a daily basis. So China's international environment has changed fundamentally. So the same foreign policy approach China has adopted is not going to yield the same results. In fact, the challenges today China faces are completely different from those China faced, say, 20 years ago. So the big question is, will China handle these challenges in the next phase? The answer is that it lies in its political leadership, in its political system. I will talk about sort of three consequences and implications of China's economic growth and how these consequences and implications affected U.S.-China relations. Obviously, the story of China, as Tom said, is a growth story. But we tend to be confused about this growth story. We tend to lump together 30 years of reform as one episode. It actually consists of two sub-periods, the 1980s and the post-1980s. The last 20 years of reform and opening and the first 10 years of reform opening are actually very different. China were two entirely different societies, not in terms of per capita income, but in terms of government policies and the effects on Chinese society, effects on Chinese politics. The challenges, the imbalances we see today are mainly the results of the economic growth of the last 20 years, not the first 10 years of economic reform. I'm not going to go into details, but if you look at all kinds of social indicators, you'll find that in the 1980s, the level of social inequality was much lower. Government services were much more plentiful than government services today. And China's relationship with the West was much more positive in the 1980s. And of course, politics in the 1980s was very different. It was far more open. Universities were very different. I was a product of higher education in China in the 1980s. I go to China all the time, and the difference in terms of the intellectual atmosphere, the professionalism, the interest in ideas in learning is night and day. You just do not have the same kind of intellectual atmosphere in China as we experienced in the early 80s. But let's just go back to the main storylines. First, let's look at the social, the consequences and implications of China's rise are very complex. They are, on some respects, they're very negative. On some respects, they're very positive. On some respects, they're very ambiguous. So let me just go through them one by one. I think in terms of the social costs of China's economic growth, I don't know what my economist colleagues think about this. Probably they don't think about social costs very often, but I do. I think social costs of China's economic growth have been very high. The problem is that you do not factor that in calculating GDP growth. It simply is not an economic concept. But not being an economic concept does not mean that it does not have social consequences or impacts. And well, let's just look at what has happened to Chinese society in the last 20 years. In three areas, you see manifest deterioration in the quality of life. Most importantly, environmental pollution. This is a very key indicator. 800,000 people, almost 1 million people a year, die of air pollution and water pollution. How do you calculate economic losses for that? And government services, social services, government spending on social services has declined precipitously. In the 1980s, for example, end of the 1980s, the Chinese government spent roughly 38% of all the healthcare spending. But I think 2 or 3 years ago, the figure was down to something like 18%. So huge. And if you look at education outlays, even though China's total education spending has increased, the government share has plunged. It used to be 85%, today it's 65%. That's because the Chinese government has changed its function almost fundamentally in the last 20 years. It was not a government that was in the business of providing social services. It was a government that is exclusively focused on economic growth. So you get growth, of course, and that's a sort of positive development. But it does not mean that growth did not come without social cost. And obviously, in terms of social cohesion in China, the increase in the level of inequality is astonishing. End of 1980s, look across the board. Gini coefficient was 34 basis points. Today it's 46 basis points. You look at rural-urban consumption gap, mid-1980s was actually the most equal, the most inclusive period of growth. Consumption gap between urban and rural areas fell significantly. Regional income disparity also narrowed in the 1980s. It was far more balanced. And the Chinese government often talks about poverty reduction, one of the greatest success stories of China's reform. You have to look at the data. The bulk of the poverty reduction was achieved in the 1980s because of agricultural reform. Today, the speed of poverty reduction in China has fallen tremendously. So this is the dark side of rapid growth. These are obviously failures of government policy and of the political system as a whole. Then we look at the other aspect, which is more encouraging. That is, Chinese society, thanks to modernization, economic growth, has become far more complex, far more autonomous from the Chinese state. Chinese individual freedom has expanded beyond dream anybody can think of. I see in the audience a lot of people from China. I bet when you applied to go study at the University of Washington, you did not even think about the possibility that the government would deny you a visa. When I applied in the early 80s, you had to go through so many hoops because the Chinese government simply did not trust its own people. That they could go abroad and not return. Of course, if you don't trust your people, they don't trust the government. That's why it's a state. But on the whole, Chinese society has acquired a level of autonomy and independence and individual freedom that is beyond anybody's imagination. And then the information revolution has empowered Chinese citizenry. So, and you also see lawyers, social activists taking all kinds of risks in challenging government policies on issues such as the rights of AIDS patients, evictions of urban residents for development projects, and so on and so forth. So at the other side of the ledger, you see Chinese society now gaining strength and momentum in asserting its own, not just rights, its own autonomy vis-a-vis the Chinese state. And that force is going to be there. I think Liu Xiaobo is being awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. The Charter 08, which is the document he drafted, will remain a landmark in Chinese history because this is not an isolated incident. It reflects the underlying currents in Chinese society. And what about political consequences of China's growth? The standard modernization theory claims that if you have rapid economic growth, you're going to have expansion in political democracy. This has not happened in China. I would say that China has seen an expansion in personal freedom, in society's autonomy, but this expansion has not been reflected in China's political system because today, by and large, Chinese people have very few established, dependable, institutionalized channels of influencing public policy. China does not even have free elections beyond the village level. So what about political consequences? I think several things happened as a result of rapid economic growth. First of all, the mindset of the Chinese elites changed. In the 1980s, China's Communist Party was actually entertaining, even though very briefly, the possibility of democratic reform. After 1992, that possibility was gone because they did not need to. Economic growth provides a source of political legitimacy. This is non-common sense. The Chinese government gets it. Chinese people understand this. The other consequence is that instead of, say, guiding China in a direction that will provide more channels of public participation, the Chinese government is now rationalizing China's experience. Even though in the Western academic circles, the concept of the China model is not taken seriously. Within China, it is a very serious topic for intellectual discussion because the Chinese government somehow believes it has found the secret of success in the post-communist world for authoritarian regimes. And it has devoted enormous resources to rationalizing, coming up with some coherent explanation of this model. Whether this model exists or not does not concern us. But the very fact that the current Chinese political elites think that it is necessary to focus or to come up with some kind of intellectual model is worrisome because it completely goes against Deng Xiaoping's pragmatic philosophy. Deng Xiaoping is somebody who does things without worrying about theory. But here we have his successors who somehow believe that they need a theory to justify the current system. What lies behind this, what worries me is that this is not a temporary phenomenon. This is a group of political elites who would like to resist political change in the direction of democracy, and not only rely on economic growth to stay in power, but rely on a set of ideological justifications to stay in power. And the third political consequence is the rise of nationalism. This is particularly salient among the younger population. It is, of course, the result of a very successful patriotic education campaign launched by the Chinese government in the 1990s, but it is now becoming a source of friction between China and the rest of the world, because the people in China sees China's relationship with the rest of the world in a very different way. Outside China, China is perceived as aggressive, assertive, but inside China, the Chinese government is perceived as weak, spineless, as kowtowing to the West. And that's because of the rise of nationalist sentiments. So going forward, how will these consequences and implications affect U.S.-China relations? It's a very mixed picture. The U.S. Economically, I think the imbalances, the growth model China pursues affects American interests and is a source of friction between the U.S. and China. If you talk about currency issues, intellectual property rights, market access, all of these things have to do with the control of vital economic resources by the Chinese state, the degree of intervention by the government in the Chinese economy. But if you look at the growing social complexity of Chinese society, that provides a source of hope for the American government, for the American public as well, because U.S. engagement with China does have an ideological agenda. The U.S. wants to change China, wants to see economic development changing China's political system. On the political front, China's continual resilience of China's Communist Party and its apparent success in maintaining control of its power worries the U.S. a great deal because, as I said, it does not fulfill this desire of changing China politically. So today, many of the problems between the U.S. and China can be traced to the political origin. I would say as long as the Chinese political system remains authoritarian, American engagement with China has limits. Or there can be no strategic trust. One side will look at the other from the prism of distrust. You always see conspiracy on the other side. And that's a reality of life. It's sad, but it's a reality of life. All you need to do is to compare two visits. This is where I will end. Compare Obama's visit to Beijing, November last year, a year ago, and compare Obama's visit to India. One rising power, one risen power, one a lot fewer business opportunities in India than China, because the Indian economy is 1/4 of China's size. But the level of political trust, the kind of warmth, night and day in terms of difference. Obama was not allowed to have a televised, national televised speech. He was given one in India. He did not have a chance to have press conference. He had one. He could address India's parliament. He was nowhere near the Great Hall of the People to talk to China's unelected National People's Congress. So I think it's something worth reflecting upon. Okay, thank you.